My wife, Stacy, and I have been together for about 6 years. We met in college and got married pretty young. Looking back, I can't believe how blind I was to the warning signs. Her phone was always on silent and attached to her hand. She was dressing up more often even when she said she was just meeting a friend, and our sex life took a nosedive. I told myself, it's just a rough patch, she's probably stressed from work. But a tiny voice in my head kept telling me there was more to it. And that was the beginning of this nightmare. To be clear, I'm not a saint by any means, but I've always tried to be a supportive husband. I knew something was going wrong. I just never thought my wife, someone I trusted more than anyone, could be lying to my face. Alright, so after I started suspecting something was off with Stacy, I began paying closer attention to all the little details, like times she said she'd be home but wasn't, or random phone calls and messages she got at weird hours. And trust me, I hated feeling like some paranoid creep, but every time I asked her a question, she'd snap at me. That's not like her at all. She's always been the type to vent about her day, not shut me out with one-word answers. But now, everything was none of my business or just work drama, Chad. I remember this one night specifically. She came home at almost midnight, claiming she'd been at her friend Becky's house. When I asked why she didn't text me, she rolled her eyes and said, "Why do you always have to be so damn needy?" I froze. This was the same person who used to blow up my phone with cute little messages if I didn't text back within 10 minutes. Now I was needy for wondering where she'd been for hours. That was just one of the many red flags waving right in my face. I also noticed she was buying new clothes, like, way more than usual. She'd come home with bags from fancy boutiques, way beyond her usual budget, and shrug it off like it was no big deal. When I'd ask her why she needed a new dress or pair of heels, she'd just smile and say, "I deserve nice things. You should be happy for me." That's not exactly how we used to talk about spending money, but I let it slide because I didn't want to come across as controlling. Honestly, I was scared to upset her further, since every little question I asked turned into an argument. It wasn't just the clothes, though. She'd constantly be texting someone, face practically glued to her phone screen. Whenever I'd try to look over her shoulder or ask who she was talking to, she'd lock her phone instantly and claim it was her coworkers bitching about the boss. I got so tired of hearing the phrase, "It's just work stuff," that I could have screamed. It felt like I was living with a complete stranger who wanted absolutely nothing to do with me. The final straw in this phase of my investigation was the moment I found a receipt in her car for a fancy dinner at a restaurant we never went to before, date and time stamped on a night she said she was hitting the gym. When I confronted her about it, she just shrugged and said it was from some office celebration. But the part that killed me was that my buddy, Steve, who works near that same restaurant, told me he saw Stacy there a few nights back, definitely not with a group of coworkers. I felt this knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I wanted to believe her so badly, but everything pointed to one thing: Stacy was lying. And yet, I tried to cling to the hope that there was some logical explanation for all of this. Turns out, I was kidding myself. So here's the moment where everything went from me feeling crazy and paranoid to undeniable proof smacking me in the face. I'll never forget it. It was a Wednesday evening, and Stacy was apparently working late again. I was honestly tired of pacing around the house waiting for her to come home and ignoring that sick feeling in my stomach. I decided to distract myself by tidying up, hoping that doing something productive would stop me from spiraling. While I was vacuuming the living room, I saw her laptop sitting on the coffee table. It was half open, and a little voice in my head said, "Dude, just check. You might find something." I hesitated because I've always respected privacy in our marriage, but the thought of being in the dark felt even worse. So I sat down, opened her laptop, and waited for it to wake up from sleep mode. I didn't have to dig very deep. Her inbox was open, like she'd been in the middle of writing an email. Right there in the subject line was something like, "Hey baby, about last night, my heart dropped into my stomach. I couldn't help but click through it, and the content was exactly what I feared. Explicit details about having mind-blowing sex in some motel on the other side of town and how they couldn't wait to do it again. The guy's name was Brad. I actually recognized the name. He was someone from her circle of friends, the cocky jerk I've always hated. It felt like an out-of-body experience, reading these lines about my wife's affair, written out in plain text. The worst part was how casually she talked about it, like hooking up in secret was no big deal. She even mentioned a new hotel she wanted to try, referencing that she could sneak out more easily because I wouldn't question it. I wish I could say my first reaction was anger, but honestly, I just went completely numb. Like an idiot, I kept scrolling. I found more emails. Some were short messages about meeting times, others were pictures, which I immediately regretted seeing. I actually had to pause and throw up. Right there in our living room, I got physically sick from the betrayal. After I pulled myself together, I closed the laptop, placed it back exactly as I found it, and just sat on the couch for what felt like hours, staring at the wall. The truth was out, and there was no going back. Let me tell you, confronting Stacy was the single most nerve-wracking thing I've ever done. I mean, it's one thing to snoop and find evidence, but it's a whole other level to look your spouse in the eye and say, I know you're sleeping with someone else. That evening, after I discovered the emails, I waited up for her. She strutted in around 11 p.m. with that same dismissive attitude, tossing her purse on the table and barely acknowledging me. My heart was pounding. I just blurted out, Stacy, cut the crap. I know about Brad. I saw your emails. I was expecting panic, maybe denial, or even tears. Instead, I got a full-on defensive meltdown. She glared at me like I was the one who'd wronged her. Her first words? What the hell, Chad? You were snooping through my computer? No apology, no shame, she went straight into attack mode. I whipped out my phone, where I'd taken pictures of the emails, and said, don't even try to lie. I have screenshots. She grabbed my phone, glanced at it, and then had the nerve to push me away with a sneer, like I was some stalker ex-boyfriend. Then came the excuses. Holy crap, the excuses. She claimed the emails were all just jokes that she and Brad used to flirt around with at work, and that it was harmless role-playing. She actually tried telling me I was reading too much into it, that I had no right to be angry. I could feel my blood boiling. It was unreal how she was trying to gaslight me, especially considering the receipts and pictures I'd seen were way beyond innocent flirting. Next came the inevitable blame game, you've been so distant, Chad, and, you never pay attention to me. As if that's a valid reason to cheat. I tried staying calm, but I ended up shouting, you think having actual sex with Brad is my fault? She just crossed her arms and looked away, saying I wouldn't understand. The emotional whiplash was intense. One moment she was acting like she did nothing wrong, and the next she was making me feel guilty for not being loving enough to keep her from straying. I felt like I was losing my mind. My wife of 6 years was telling me that her affair was something I drove her to. But I stood my ground. I told her, I'm not going anywhere. Not until you admit what you did. Her response? Fine, Chad. If you want me to say I had sex with Brad, there, I said it. Happy? And then she stormed off to the bedroom and slammed the door in my face. I was left in the living room, shaking with adrenaline and heartbreak. I honestly didn't know if I wanted to scream or break down crying. The worst part is, I'd hoped for some sign of remorse or guilt, but she was acting like this was just another petty fight. No apology, no tears, just pure anger and deflection. And that's when I really understood how messed up the situation was. That night, after Stacy stormed off, I just sat on the couch in total shock. The weight of what had just happened felt crushing, like someone had punched a hole straight through my chest. I kept replaying the confrontation in my head, trying to make sense of her twisted reactions. Was she really telling me her affair was somehow my fault? The fact that she refused to show any sign of guilt or remorse was honestly harder to stomach than the cheating itself. I didn't sleep a wink. Eventually, I walked into the bedroom to grab a pillow and blanket, fully intending to crash on the couch. She was awake, glaring at me like I was intruding on her space. I half expected her to say something, an apology, or at least an attempt to talk. Instead, she just sighed dramatically and rolled over, ignoring me. It was the loneliest feeling in the world, lying there on the couch, realizing the person I'd loved and trusted for 6 years had turned into a complete stranger overnight. All the memories of our good times, our college days, the road trips, even our wedding, felt tainted. The next morning, she acted like nothing happened. Seriously, she grabbed her keys and left for work, barely looking in my direction. No, we need to talk, no, let's figure this out, just total indifference. It was a knife to the gut. I knew we had to have a real conversation at some point, but for that moment, I just let her go. I didn't have the energy to deal with more of her hostility or lies. Instead, I called my best friend, Mike, and told him everything. Hearing my own words made it more real and more painful. It also sparked the realization that I had some huge decisions to make, and fast. So after that surreal night, I felt completely off balance. My mind was spinning, and my emotions were all over the place. I went from furious to heartbroken to numb in a matter of seconds. 1 minute, I wanted to scream at Stacy for turning our marriage into a joke. The next minute, I found myself trying to analyze what I did wrong. Which is messed up, right? I knew it wasn't really my fault she cheated, but some part of me kept whispering, could you have done more to prevent this? I took the day off work because there was no way I could function normally. I spent the morning pacing around, trying to avoid the bedroom, where everything felt tainted. I actually went out onto our balcony, we live in a small apartment complex, and just stared at the skyline, asking myself if this was really happening. There's a weird sense of disbelief that clings to you in situations like this, like your brain refuses to accept reality. A little before noon, I decided to do something I rarely do. I wrote in a journal. I just started scribbling everything I was feeling, anger, betrayal, fear, like if I could just get it on paper, it might shrink down into something I could handle. Didn't quite work that way, but at least it helped me confirm that my feelings were valid. Because to be honest, Stacy's reaction the previous night had me doubting my own sanity. I also called Mike again. Poor guy got an earful, he's never heard me ramble for so long. But he was patient, trying to reassure me that I wasn't crazy and that Stacy's actions and attitude were just plain toxic. He said, look, man, at some point you gotta accept that she did this. It's on her. It stung to hear, but he was right. Blaming myself wasn't going to fix anything. I couldn't keep tiptoeing around her explosive temper, thinking that maybe I'd somehow triggered her affair. If a person chooses to cheat, that's on them, not the spouse who got blindsided. So later that same day, when Stacy finally got home from work, I felt a tiny spark of hope that maybe we could talk like adults. Yeah, I know, wishful thinking, right? As soon as she walked through the door, she looked at me with a mix of annoyance and boredom, like dealing with me was the last thing on her to-do list. I tried to keep my cool, calmly asking if we could sit down and have a real conversation. She plopped down at the kitchen table, arms crossed. I took a seat across from her, feeling more like I was interviewing for a job I didn't even want than talking to my wife. I started off by saying I just wanted some honesty, some kind of explanation for why she cheated, how she could do that to our marriage. Stacy rolled her eyes. Chad, we've already been over this. I told you, it just happened. I was bored, okay? And you were off in your own world, always playing video games, always talking about your next big idea. You left me alone. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So because I have hobbies, you decided to have sex with Brad? That's what you're saying? She shrugged like it was no big deal, which made my blood boil. I had a million questions, but I couldn't get past the fact that she was acting like I was the villain. I brought up the explicit emails, the motel receipts, the pictures, basically laid out all the evidence I'd found. Her defense? Stop being so dramatic. I'm allowed to have fun. My jaw literally dropped. In that moment, I realized she wasn't even trying to pretend she felt guilty. She was basically throwing it in my face that our marriage didn't matter anymore. That's when my anger flared up. This isn't fun, Stacy. It's betrayal, I said, my voice cracking. I expected her to at least look ashamed, but she just stared at me like I was pathetic. Then, in a move that still stings to this day, she stood up and said, "If you can't handle it, maybe you're just not cut out to be my husband anymore." And with that, she walked off to the bedroom, slamming the door. I sat there at the table, practically vibrating with frustration. Part of me wanted to chase after her, demand she talk to me. But another part was so disgusted by how she dismissed me that I couldn't even stand to be near her. I ended up punching the couch a few times, trying to release some of the rage bottled up inside. That night, I slept on the couch again, but there was no rest. My mind raced. Should I leave her right then and there? Confront Brad? Beg her to go to counseling? I didn't know what the next step was, but I knew one thing for sure: our marriage would never be the same again. I spent the rest of that night and most of the next day in a fog. Couldn't concentrate on work, couldn't stop replaying the fights in my head. I needed to talk to someone who wasn't a friend, somebody who could be objective. That's when I decided to reach out to a therapist I found online, Dr. Henderson. Their office had good reviews, and something in my gut told me I needed professional help to make sense of the chaos. During my first session, I just spilled everything, like every detail from the discovery of the emails to her shameless attitude when I confronted her. Dr. Henderson listened patiently, occasionally jotting down notes and nodding along. Finally, she leaned forward and said, "Chad, this situation isn't about your worth as a husband. It's about the choices Stacy is making." That hit me hard because I'd been stuck blaming myself, thinking maybe if I'd been more attentive, or more exciting, or less me, then Stacy wouldn't have gone looking elsewhere. But the truth was, she made that decision. She chose to betray our marriage. Sure, relationships are complicated, but nobody forces you to cheat. It's a conscious action. Dr. Henderson also helped me see that my biggest struggle right now was Stacy's total lack of remorse. It's not uncommon for someone who cheats to try to shift blame or even lash out, she explained. But that doesn't mean you have to accept it. We talked about setting boundaries, like sleeping in separate spaces until we figured out what the next step was, and maybe even giving each other physical distance if necessary. I left that session feeling a small spark of relief. Finally, someone validated that I wasn't crazy for being hurt and angry. Dr. Henderson warned me, though, that if Stacy continued to lie and manipulate, I'd be stuck in an emotional tug-of-war. She advised me to think about what I truly wanted. Was it reconciliation, with some major effort from both sides, or was it time to cut my losses? That put me in a reflective mood. As much as I hated to consider it, separation or even divorce was creeping into my mind. Still, some weird part of me wondered if there was a chance we could fix this. After all, we'd been together 6 years, could I really just walk away without a fight? Then again, was it even worth fighting if she wasn't going to own up to what she did? So after talking to Dr. Henderson, I decided it was time to set some hard boundaries with Stacy. I told her that until we could have a real conversation, one where she showed at least a shred of remorse, I was going to sleep in the living room. Also, I insisted that she stop trying to spin this around on me if we had any hope of repairing our marriage. My exact words were something like, "I need you to be honest and accountable if we're gonna stand a chance." Well, that went over like a lead balloon. When I sat Stacy down to explain this, she looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. She actually laughed, yes, laughed in my face. You need me to be accountable? For what, Chad? You're the one who's been snooping, invading my privacy, and freaking out. I couldn't believe it. She acted like I was the villain, not the guy who just discovered his wife was cheating. I kept my cool, mostly. I told her, look, I'm not interested in playing the blame game. I just want to know if you can see how hurtful and destructive this affair is. Her response? It's only destructive because you're making a big deal out of it. No joke, that's exactly what she said. I was so stunned I just stood there, staring at her like, who even are you? Things escalated when I mentioned that I'd been considering a trial separation or even divorce if we couldn't resolve this. Her eyes went wide, and she snapped, oh, so now you're threatening me with divorce because you're too weak to handle the truth? She started going on about how men always walk away when things get tough, and basically accused me of being a coward. It was mind-boggling. 5 minutes earlier, she'd been laughing about her affair, and now she was twisting it to say I was abandoning her. I lost it. I don't usually yell, but I shouted, are you seriously mad at me for not tolerating you sleeping with another guy? My hands were shaking, I felt adrenaline pumping through my veins. That's when she pulled the classic move, storming out of the apartment. She grabbed her coat, slammed the door, and left me standing there, furious and hurt. I had no clue where she went, and honestly, part of me didn't care at that point. I just couldn't handle her wild mood swings and her refusal to accept responsibility. The next few hours were torture. I paced around, telling myself not to call or text her. She was the one who walked out, and if she wanted to talk, she'd have to make the first move. Still, every time my phone buzzed, I jumped. Was it her? Was it Brad? Was I about to get hit with more nasty surprises? A couple of hours after Stacy stormed out, I was still in our apartment, restless and on edge. My phone buzzed around 10 p.m., and my heart practically jumped out of my chest. I grabbed it, expecting some half-baked apology or maybe a string of curses from Stacy. Honestly, I wasn't sure which. But nope, it was a text from my buddy Steve. It read something like, dude. I'm really sorry, but you need to see this. Attached was a photo, Stacy and Brad, at some dive bar across town, all over each other. It looked like they were mid-makeout, and there was no mistaking who it was. Stacy's bright pink jacket, the one she left wearing, practically glowed in the photo. My stomach dropped. I couldn't believe she was being so blatant about it. This wasn't just a rumor or a sneaky photo, I mean, they were out in public, where anyone could see them, including our friends. It felt like she was doing it on purpose, almost like she wanted me to know. The worst part? Steve told me he overheard Stacy laughing with Brad and telling him how she'd finally put me in my place. If that doesn't scream no remorse, I don't know what does. I'm not gonna lie, part of me wanted to hop in my car, drive to that bar, and start yelling at both of them. Another part of me just felt numb. She was basically parading her affair around like it was some twisted victory. I guess she thought humiliating me in public was a good power play. I stood there, looking at that picture, feeling my heart race with rage and despair. My mind was a chaotic mess of, should I confront them right now, and what's the point? I ended up calling Mike, my other best friend, the one who's been giving me a shoulder to cry on this whole time. He managed to calm me down, reminding me that going down there would only add fuel to the fire. Honestly, he was right. Stacy was clearly out to prove she didn't care about consequences, and a showdown in the middle of a bar would be exactly what she wanted: more drama, more attention, more excuses to paint me as the crazy jealous husband. So I stayed home, pacing and clenching my fists, trying to keep it together. I wanted to smash something, to scream until my throat was raw. But somehow, I managed to stay in control. By the time midnight rolled around, I realized she might not even come home. That was the final blow for me, the woman I married was out there flaunting her affair, no longer hiding it, no longer pretending. That's when I made the decision. I couldn't sit around waiting for her. This marriage, at least in its current state, was done. If she wanted to salvage anything, she'd have to show actual remorse and cut all ties with Brad. And judging by her actions, that wasn't likely to happen anytime soon. The morning after I got that photo from Steve, something in me finally clicked. I wasn't going to let Stacy trample all over me anymore. I woke up, well, more like I got up, because I barely slept, and started making a plan. It felt weirdly empowering. Don't get me wrong, I was still heartbroken, but a part of me switched into survival mode. First, I decided to get my finances in order. I'd been the primary earner for a while, but we had a joint account that both of us used for bills and everyday expenses. After seeing how unpredictable and, let's be real, cruel Stacy could be, I didn't want to wake up one day to find our account empty or a bunch of unexplained charges. So I opened a new personal checking account in my name only. I left enough money in the joint account to cover the next month's rent and bills, just so I couldn't be accused of anything shady, but otherwise, I moved my direct deposit and savings. I also changed my passwords on everything, banking apps, email, even social media. Next, I called my boss to request some personal days off. I was a total wreck and knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was normal. Plus, I wanted time to consult a lawyer, just in case this turned into a full-blown divorce. It was a tough call to make. I've always taken pride in being reliable at work, but my life was literally imploding, and I needed to protect myself. That afternoon, I actually met with a divorce attorney, just to see what my options were. I'm not saying I was dead set on filing for divorce right that second, but I wanted to understand my rights. The attorney explained everything about community property, spousal support, and even the possibility of proving infidelity in the settlement, though apparently that doesn't always matter in our state. He told me it was good I took steps to secure my finances, and urged me to document everything: texts, emails, receipts. My stomach churned as he talked, but at least I left his office feeling a little less helpless. While I was running around handling all this, Stacy was still MIA. She hadn't come home that night, and I'd stopped checking my phone for messages from her. It's like I was walking on a tightrope. On one side was my heartbreak and anger, and on the other side was this grim acceptance that our relationship might be truly over. By evening, I was emotionally drained, but oddly calm. I sat in our living room, scanning through old photos, wedding pictures, snapshots from vacations, silly selfies we took when we first moved in together. I wondered if all of that was just gone. Was she always this person underneath, and I just didn't see it? Or did something snap in her along the way? Just as I was about to drift off into that spiral of memories, the front door opened. Stacy was back, and she did not look happy, like I was the one who had wronged her. The moment she saw the papers from the lawyer on the coffee table, her face turned from a glare to something more furious than I'd ever seen. So there I was, sitting in our living room with my lawyer's paperwork laid out on the coffee table. My heart was still pounding from the reality of the situation. I had basically one foot out the door, and yet I hadn't fully convinced myself it was the right move. That's when Stacy burst in. She looked wrecked, messy hair, smudged makeup, and eyes burning with anger. The moment she locked onto those papers, I knew the fireworks were about to start. She snatched one of the documents, skimmed it, then whipped around to glare at me. "You're actually talking to a divorce attorney? Seriously?" Her voice was shrill, echoing off the walls. I tried to stay calm, though my stomach felt like it was doing backflips. "Yeah, Stacy," I said quietly. "I'm protecting myself. Look at what's happened between us." She spat out this bitter laugh. "Oh, so because you can't handle that I needed more in this marriage, you're just gonna run off with your tail between your legs and file for divorce? That's pathetic, Chad." I shook my head, trying to hold back the anger that was welling up inside me. It's not about me being unable to handle anything. It's about you cheating, having sex with Brad and parading it around. You made it clear that our marriage doesn't matter to you." She threw the papers down, sending them scattering across the table. "I told you, you were never there for me. What did you expect me to do? Sit around and wait for you to show some interest? I did what I had to do." That was a gut punch. She spoke about her affair like it was some kind of rational solution, and I was just too dense to understand. I couldn't help snapping back, "Don't act like fucking Brad was your only option. You could have talked to me, demanded therapy, anything but this." "Why does it matter anymore?" she scoffed, folding her arms across her chest. "You've already decided to lawyer up. Good luck finding someone else who wants a spineless husband who freaks out over every little thing." That's when I lost it. I stood up so fast my chair nearly toppled over. "I'm not the spineless one here. I'm the one who tried talking, who tried therapy, who tried everything. You're the one who snuck around and lied. I'm done being the doormat in this marriage." She didn't say anything for a second, just stared at me with pure venom. Then, in a voice so cold it gave me chills, she said, "Fine. You want a divorce? Go ahead. But don't you dare think I'll make it easy for you." And with that, she turned on her heel and walked into the bedroom, slamming the door so hard the whole place shook. I was left standing there, heart pounding, realizing that what had just happened was the final straw. There was no coming back from this level of hostility and disrespect, at least, not without serious effort on her part, and she'd made it crystal clear she had no intention of trying. After that explosive face-off, I was running on pure adrenaline. My chest felt tight, and my mind buzzed with the finality of it all. This wasn't just a fight, this was a head-on collision between what we used to be and what we'd become. Even if, in some parallel universe, Stacy apologized and begged for forgiveness, I knew things would never fully go back to normal. The damage was done, and it wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was a series of manipulations, lies, and blatant disrespect. That night, I curled up on the couch again, trying to remind myself that I was doing the right thing by seeking legal advice. Still, a tiny voice inside me kept asking, "Are you sure? Are you really ready to lose everything you built together?" The pictures on our walls, the memories tied to every piece of furniture, it was all tainted, but also still achingly familiar. It's a bizarre feeling, missing someone who's right in the next room, yet a million miles away emotionally. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through social media, but everything triggered me. Seeing other couples posting holiday photos, or just got engaged announcements, made me feel like an even bigger failure. I used to think Stacy and I were the perfect team, my calm nature balanced out her fiery spirit. Now, that fiery spirit felt more like a raging inferno that had burned down our marriage. Eventually, I gave up on distractions and decided to face my emotions head-on. I sat there, actually letting myself mourn the relationship we once had. I'm not going to lie, there were tears, and there was a gut-wrenching sense of loss. But there was also a strange sense of relief creeping in. It felt like, in accepting the worst, I was finally setting myself free. Free from walking on eggshells, free from wondering where she was and who she was with, free from the constant blame shifting that made me question my own worth. That acceptance didn't magically fix my heartbreak, though. I still felt raw and betrayed. I called Mike again, just to have someone remind me I wasn't alone. He told me he'd help however he could, whether it was letting me crash at his place or just being there to talk. Those small gestures meant a lot, especially since Stacy was acting like my existence was a nuisance. Not long after, I heard the bedroom door open. She stepped out briefly, probably heading to the kitchen, but didn't say a word to me. No good night, no hey, can we talk? Just cold silence. For a second, I thought about trying to break the ice, but I caught myself. It was her affair, her choices that wrecked our marriage. If she wanted to fix anything at all, that first step needed to come from her. And she'd made it abundantly clear she wasn't interested. From that point on, I focused on my own sanity. I told myself I'd do whatever it took to heal, even if it meant walking away from this marriage for good. I had no idea how messy or painful the next steps would be, but at least I had a direction, forward. By the next day, I'd made up my mind. I was done letting Stacy's drama hold me hostage. I texted her around noon, saying we needed to iron out some logistics, like who was staying in the apartment, how to split the bills, that kind of thing. She never replied. Typical. I tried to keep myself busy doing productive stuff, gathering more financial documents, reorganizing my personal belongings, and mentally preparing myself for a real separation. It wasn't exactly a walk in the park, but every step made me feel a bit more in control. Late that evening, Stacy finally showed up, and I'll never forget the look on her face. She was smirking, like she had a secret that was about to make my life worse. I braced myself. Sure enough, she waltzed in holding a piece of paper that looked suspiciously official. She dropped it on the coffee table and said, "You're not the only one who can talk to a lawyer, Chad." I glanced at it. It was a letter from some high-powered attorney's office. Apparently, she was claiming I'd been emotionally neglectful and creating a toxic environment. My jaw dropped. I didn't even know what to say. Here she was, cheating on me and openly flaunting it, and yet she had the audacity to paint me as the villain. To top it off, she threatened to go after me for alimony because she gave up some career opportunities when we first got married. I felt a jolt of anger surge through me. "You're kidding, right?" I said, my voice shaking. "You cheated. You lied. You're trying to bleed me dry now, too?" She just shrugged, smiling in this smug, infuriating way. "If you're going to push for a divorce, you'd better be ready to pay for it." I realized something in that moment. I was actually relieved to see her stoop this low. It was like the final piece of the puzzle that convinced me I wasn't crazy for wanting out. The woman I'd married was long gone. This version of Stacy was manipulative, vindictive, and downright cruel. I told her flat out, "Do what you need to do. I'm finished trying to fix something you clearly don't care about." She just narrowed her eyes and said, "Fine," before stomping off to the bedroom. So much for any chance of an adult conversation about dividing up assets and deciding who'd move out first. Despite how twisted it all felt, a weird sense of calm settled over me. I was done tiptoeing around her temper, done trying to find silver linings in a thunderstorm. If she wanted a legal battle, I was prepared. I'd already documented her affair, my own attempts to reconcile, and her refusal to accept any blame. If she wanted to keep digging this hole, that was on her. I felt a small spark of hope flicker inside me, the sense that I might actually get out of this nightmare and build a new life, free from her endless gaslighting and blame games. Yeah, it was terrifying, but it also felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, ready to leap towards something better. And in that moment, I knew, I deserved better. After Stacy dropped that lawyer's letter on me, it became crystal clear that our marriage was done. We weren't two people trying to fix something, we were two strangers fighting to protect our own interests. It hurt like hell to finally admit that, but sometimes the truth sets you free, even if it feels like tearing off a bandage that's welded to your skin. In the days that followed, I officially filed for separation. I moved most of my stuff out and crashed with Mike for a while. He was a total lifesaver. My parents, siblings, and a few close friends were incredibly supportive, too. Of course, word got around about Stacy and Brad, and let's just say a lot of people in our circle lost respect for her. Some even reached out to me privately to say they were sorry they hadn't seen the warning signs sooner or hadn't believed me when I first started voicing suspicions. On my end, I went from feeling like a devastated mess to a guy on a mission. I wanted to heal and move on. The hardest part was realizing I had to let go of the fantasy that Stacy might come around, apologize sincerely, or beg for a second chance. That dream was toast the minute she kept flaunting her affair. Sure, I still had moments of sadness, grieving the years we spent together, the plans we made, the future I thought we'd share. But each day, I felt a little stronger. Therapy helped a lot, too. Dr. Henderson reminded me that healing is never a straight line, it's full of ups, downs, and random detours. Some days you might hate the world, other days you might feel oddly optimistic. But she was right about one thing: cheating is always the cheater's choice, not the victim's fault. It doesn't matter if your partner's bored or they think you weren't attentive enough. There are a million better ways to handle relationship issues than sleeping with someone else. That's on them, not on you. In time, I sorted out the legal stuff. Thankfully, my documentation made it easier to ensure I wasn't left high and dry. We hammered out a settlement, painful, yes, but at least I could finally see the finish line. I handed over the keys to the old apartment, not that I could stomach living there with all those memories, and focused on starting fresh. My new place isn't anything fancy, but it feels like a blank canvas where I can rebuild my life on my own terms. Bye-bye. Like for more stories.